Welcome to the Orange Pew. Welcome to the Orange Pew. You said you remember these orange pews.
I don't remember them being this uncomfortable.
Right.
But I think they were sat on so many times that the padding is gone. But
now everyone listening to the podcast knows that we have super uncomfortable surroundings for our guests. Well, we're excited today to be able to get into this podcast. And we're excited because Israel is a hot topic right now. And Wayne and Ann Hilsden were with us on a Sunday. And we were able to link to all of our campuses, and it was amazing. We were able to hear some of your story. But people listening today maybe weren't a part of that service. This podcast is for CLA. It's for our network. It's for young leaders. And so we want to just start with maybe a little bit about your story briefly, Wayne. You were a young guy, and you went to Israel. So tell us how that happened.
Yeah, we were 28 when we first met a guy named Jim Cantelon at his church in north of Toronto. I was happy as a pastor in downtown Toronto. My wife was a music director at both the church and TV show called 100 Huntley Street. And in fact, she was there from the very beginning of that program. And we were on vacation, stopped at a church where Jim Cantelon was the pastor on a Sunday, saw us in the crowd, said to his wife, "Hey, let's have Wayne and Ed over for dinner." So we went to their home, and Jim started to tell us about having just come back from Israel and southern Lebanon. He used to do a radio broadcast out of southern Lebanon, filling in for people on vacation or whatever. And as he's looking at Israel from southern Lebanon, gets this impression that the Lord wants to do something. He wanted to establish a program called Kibbutz Shalom to bring Canadian volunteers, young people, to Israel to work on the kibbutzim, work shoulder to shoulder with the kibbutzniks, and be a witness. And when he shared that vision with some government officials in Israel, they said, "Well, you can't run that from Canada. You'd have to live here to really make that effective." And he said, "Well, how would I live here?" "Well, we can get you a clergy visa. And by the way, there's a lot of people like you in Jerusalem. They'd probably love to have a church from your evangelical Pentecostal background. And you could start a church."
Wow.
So he's telling us this crazy story, like Israeli government suggesting planting a church in Jerusalem. And I was skeptical. But in the middle of the conversation, he suddenly gets this revelation. "Hey, would you and Ann come and help us plant that church?" And he hadn't even resigned yet, by the way. He was letting us in on this confidential information. He said, "But we're moving to Israel." So we ended up doing a spy out the land tour just after they arrived in Israel. We didn't want to be totally crazy. We wanted to see it with our own eyes. Never been to Israel before. And felt, yes, this is it. And we didn't go right away. It took us a year and a half to get ready. But Jim said, "Come when it's time to start the church." And so we did. August of 1983.
And that church is called today the King of Kings Assembly. Is that right?
We use the term community. We actually think that term says what we want to be, a community. Assembly sounds like you gather somewhere, but
Right.
We believe the church is more than just a gathering.
And it's multi-site.
It is multi-site, and we plant churches.
Right.
We've had three main goals: plant churches, train leaders, and be a catalyst for unity.
Mm-hmm.
And we've lived that way for these 40 years.
I want to get back to the church in a minute. But first, as a Canadian who has been there now for 40 years, which is longer actually than you lived in Canada.
Yeah.
What are some of the big impressions that you had in this experience?
Well, when we got there, it felt like a third world country, to be honest. It was not very sophisticated. And, the country started in 1948 and we arrived in 1983, so it wasn't very old. The impression also was a very secular nation. Maybe 10, maybe 15% of people would be religious
Okay.
in any way.
Hmm.
I'm talking about the Jewish part of the population, because you also have Arabs that are citizens of Israel. And the interest becoming more and more religious. And we moved to Jerusalem, which is the heart, it's the capital of the Jewish people.
Right.
And that's where most of the religious have decided they're going to live. They go to the Western Wall and pray.
Right.
It's the Western supporting wall of the temple built by Solomon and Herod. So that's, they gravitate to that site and want to live as close to the Western Wall as possible.
So the Christian church there, obviously, it's been there from the beginning. The church was birthed in Jerusalem. What would be the focus of King of Kings and the church in Jerusalem and in Israel?
Yeah. Well, we believe in the Great Commission, Matthew 28. Gospel, the good news that Jesus is the only Savior. We believe that you've got to live out your faith. So it's the gospel through both spoken word and good works.
Right.
That people may glorify the Father through your good deeds. So we just believe living that out in very practical ways. And also because the gospel is not necessarily liked because of 2,000 years of tragic history between Jews and Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And Jewish people actually being persecuted by so-called Christians.
Mm-hmm.
It was important to us not to just be a voice. We had to really repent for a lot of things. Just say, hey, we're sorry.
Right.
We didn't treat you well. And so we came in not in any way shy of the gospel. I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God unto salvation for all who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, Paul says in Romans 1:16, but quietly, not loud, and earn the right, in a sense, to even be there and to share the gospel.
I want to pick up on two things: King of Kings, and then a ministry that you developed called Firm. Co-host here today is Doug Frederick. So in our first episode, it was Doug and I, and I want to acknowledge that he's here, and he's actually here to ask some questions. He met with some students today to talk about some things Israel related, and he's going to bring some questions. So I just want to acknowledge that he's here and he's ready to ask some questions.
Check one.
But before he does that, just a little bit of maybe more background for people. King of Kings, you told me a great story. King of Kings actually was gonna get a site, I think, and it was a person in City Hall, that was strategically there, and then disappeared within a couple of months, and it was like a moment, like literally a moment in time. And so, tell us that story. It's kind of cool.
Yeah. So I got this sense from the Lord after a personal retreat in the Galilee that we were to go and look for property to build a worship center. And it was impossible in our mind, the multi-millions of dollars it would take, then to get the right zoning, downtown Jerusalem for several hundred people. We looked at a lot of properties that they looked great, but then you couldn't gather that many people. We found this old beat-up theater. It was 800 seats, and they couldn't make any money because it was too big. I actually went to a couple of movies there before I saw the place again. By the time I saw it, it was like a cave. There was no electricity, no seats left, old movie reels on the floor, old popcorn containers. But I had this sense, this is the place, and gathered a number of pastors of other congregations in the city. and said, "Hey, would you pray with me in this place?" And they all believed it was the Lord. And I said on Sunday that, it was easy for them to say because they didn't have to raise the money to do this.
And it was millions of dollars. It ended
Yeah, it
up,
was 2.8 million US to buy it,
yeah.
and then you had a shell. That's it, and you had to rebuild the place. So it was $8.5 million
Wow.
in the end,
Wow.
and that was a miracle right there. But one of the great miracles, and you referred to it, was our architect needed to go to City Hall to get a building permit to reconstruct it and build it differently. And he was nervous, even though he had been on the building committee for 10 years himself. So he goes to City Hall with the plans, and the lady that processes the initial application said, "Well, who's behind this project?"
And that's what he's nervous about, right?
Yeah.
Letting them know that it's church.
It's the fact that we're believers and
Right.
we want our own property.
Yeah.
So she said, "Well, who's the principal person behind this project?" And he says, "Well, Wayne Hilsden." She said, "Yaakov, I like you, but I like Wayne Hilsden even better."
Wow.
It turns out she was our landlady.
Amazing.
We were living in her apartment for 5 years. We paid our rent on time. She liked us. And so she went to work to process this as fast as possible. And I can tell you right now, it can take many months, even years, to get a building permit. The Baptist church, unfortunately, some ultra-Orthodox people came and burnt the church to the ground. And they tried to rebuild it on the same property where there was a church. And it took them, I think it was over 10 years to get a building permit to rebuild. And so I'm thinking, okay, we've signed on the dotted line. We're committed to buy this place. What if we can't even build it on the property? Anyway, long story short, she gets the building permit in 1 week, and then she retires the next month, and that was the end of her career at City Hall.
One other story, because this is the podcast of CLA and its network. There's a unique story that CLA played in that early day. Yeah, and it kind of is faith inspiring, especially for the church in Canada that sometimes seems not to be backing global cause as much as it once did. Tell us that story.
Yeah, well, back in those days, it was 20 years ago, and there were orange pews.
Yeah, just
I
like
remember
this.
that. And
with more padding, though.
right. I came to see the senior pastor, and it was Brent Canelon at the time. And I just shared the vision of what we were doing to build this. We called it actually a performing arts center, and it is a performing arts center. It's a beautiful place. And we're
going to show some, I think we're going to actually show some pictures.
Yeah, I mean, the cultural community in Jerusalem rents it from us regularly. Anyway, I just shared with Brent the vision that we really believe God's called us to build this place. And, I know Brent really well now, and we're good friends. But at the time, I thought he seemed like not that interested. And within a week or two, I'm hearing that he's going to go to the annual general meeting of Christian Life Assembly and present the idea of loaning us $1 million in order to do this project. Wow. And I had never heard of such a thing, any church in the world. And, I wasn't that well known to the church here at that time. And for them to vote, and it was like 95 or 96% in favor of loaning us this money. And it was not without collateral. I mean, just loan you the money.
Yeah. And
thankfully, within a few months, we were able to pay it off. And then CLA gave us $250,000 as a gift. Mm. And that was such a huge step for us to go the next mile, and also just to feel affirmed that this isn't just a crazy idea, that God is in this, and to have a church as influential and as great a church as CLA is, to have that backing just gave us extra faith and a boost. Yeah.
And now we're trying to do it again.
Yeah.
Actually. But it's for something else.
Yeah.
And so there was a succession plan at King of Kings, mm-hmm. and you opened up what I think is just one of the most spectacular things in bringing unity, in bringing focus, and fanning the flames of God and the gospel of Christ in Israel. Tell us a little bit about that ministry?
Yeah. Well, from the beginning, we had this three-pronged thrust: plant churches, train leaders, be a catalyst for unity. So that was already part of who we were. And, being there 30 years and knowing this is important to us, we built relationships of trust with all of the ministries in the country, across every denomination and type of ministry. So when I got this burden to start something called FIRM, which is an acronym for Fellowship of Israel-Related Ministries, it was to bring as many quality, effective ministries together to do it better together, to get synergy happening, and to be a partial answer to Jesus' prayer to the Father before he went to the cross, that we may be one, that the world would know that the Father sent him into the world and that he loves the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we ought to be doing that everywhere in the world. And so it was just such a conviction that we began to invite quality ministries to be part of this association FIRM. And I thought, maybe 15, 20 ultimately would want to be part of this. I didn't think everybody would want to join it. But today we have 75 ministries, each of them vetted. So we look at their governance, we look at their theology, we look at their reporting to the government. Every year they have to get a certificate that they've reported as a charity. We look at their relationship with other ministries, so they're not competitive, but they're collaborative. And then ministries that apply to us that they're not quite there, we don't usually say no, but we say not yet. And here's an area that if you'd strengthen that area, then you'd qualify to be one of our local partners. And I think it's raised the bar, for ministries to see that there is a standard.
Right.
And not that it's, that we know everything about ministry, but there's basic biblical principles that we ought to abide by. There needs to be integrity. There needs to be accountability. There needs to be,
way to go.
That's what we do.
I've been there a couple of times with FIRM, and I just am so amazed at how diverse the ministries are. Yeah. So one day we're picking up garbage along the Sea of Galilee. I forget the name of that.
Called Beautiful Land Initiative.
The Beautiful Land Initiative. So one of the groups is about cleaning up Israel. And then another was, I think, helping women. I think the abortion rate was really high.
It's called Ba'ad Chaim, pro-life.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so that was a very unique ministry. And then some of them are churches. Yeah. Other churches that are being planted. So I just thought it was in Canada, we have something called the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, kind of brings people together, And so I just think, Wayne, that's the most amazing thing. And we're going to have another guest, Doug, in a couple weeks. And his name is Michael
Mistretta.
Yeah, and he actually is the president?
He is the CEO. I just believed in this guy. And I'm all about raising up younger leaders. I'm a bit of a risk taker in that regard, but I just sensed this is the guy. And so we launched it in February of 2015. He was 22 by then. He was really mature. And he's leading the ministry. So you're going to meet somebody who's talented and he's anointed. And just he's pulled together a team it's the A team. I've never been part of a team like it.
Now, speaking of young men and young women, Pastor Doug is a part-time staff here at CLA, and he is also part-time. He's professor of pastoral theology at Summit College. He works with young men and young women going into ministry every day, including today.
I'm definitely not the young man, though. I'm not young. I feel very old.
You are coming straight from a discussion with some younger leaders, and so Israel is a big topic right now.
Yeah, I was actually really surprised today because, when we're listening to this podcast, when this podcast comes out, it's obviously maybe a few weeks after you share it on Sunday, and it was a great Sunday. But it was interesting today because there were students in other classes that were asking professors what they thought, and students in my class too, what they thought about CLA taking the whole month of this month to talk and highlight Israel, especially what's happening in Gaza. And so I think this podcast too, what we're going to enjoy about this podcast is with our guests, maybe go a little bit deeper than we could on a Sunday morning. So again, Wayne, thanks for, I have some questions, probably based on millennials. They are concerned the milieu of it, and maybe you can sift through it. But the big one would be, and this is a big word in our world, is that they're concerned about genocide taking place with the IDF against civilians in Gaza. And so part of that was also tied in with like about the land. Like, are they as young believers, are they still committed to that land piece based on knowing that Israel is a lot more secular than probably we would think? So the questions is modern day Israel the same as biblical Israel? And the covenant that God gave them the land, the keeping of the land is also based upon keeping covenant. So if it's a secular nation, then how does that work? And then Leviticus, I think it's 46 and 48, about treating the alien like you are like a son or a daughter. So all those questions were coming out today in class, and there's a lot there, Wayne. So maybe you just want to jump into it. But I have another question following.
Maybe we could start with covenant, because that's an interesting question about.
Families of the earth. So God didn't just call the Jews the chosen people for their sake, and they're the exclusive people, but ultimately Jews were called to be a chosen royal priesthood. And if we understand priesthood, they're like a mediator between man and God. Israel is a priestly nation. Their call was to lead the whole world, Gentiles, to know the God of Israel, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of course, that's repeated over and over again. That's who he is. He's identified by that very people he made covenant with. We understand that very promise of I'm going to be your God, and you will be my people, and you will be my priestly nation. It's repeated to Isaac and to Jacob. So some people say, well, the covenant was with Abraham, and Abraham's also the father of many nations, not just the Jews. But because it's repeated all the way to Jacob, and we remember Jacob's name is changed to Israel.
Right.
God is then identified with Israel, a people group. Yeah. So that covenant has some interesting elements. When it comes to land, and that's the most controversial piece, I think, is that God meets Abraham and says, I'm going to bless you, and you're going to bless the nations, and I'm going to give you a land.
Yeah.
And in those days, in ancient times, not only in Israel, but the surrounding nations in the Middle East, when a serious covenant or agreement is made between two parties, these two parties go through a ritual, which is kind of strange, but they take an animal, they cut the pieces of that animal, they place them on two sides of, as it were, a path. And the two parties, the two individuals usually, would walk through that path together. The cut pieces of meat are to symbolize this is the kind of thing that will happen if we break covenant. And you can study the history of this. I'm not making this up. I mean, this was an ancient ritual in that whole region. Well, in that case, in Genesis, it says that God, and he's pictured as a furnace, a fiery furnace that goes through the path by himself. It's an unconditional, unilateral covenant, not bilateral. Abraham's out of the picture at this point. So God has promised a place, a piece of real estate to a nation, that's not to say that they are the owners of the land. They're really the tenants, but they're a protected tenant. God is the landlord, and God can at any point say, it's time for you to leave my apartment, leave my building, leave my land. And God actually disciplined the nation of Israel on occasion and exiled them from the very piece of real estate he promised to them. However, and we see this in many places, and I'll highlight Ezekiel 36. God says, okay, I've scattered you to the nations, but you've profaned my name in the nations. How have you profaned God's name? You've profaned my name by the fact that you've been scattered and you're not in the land that I promised by covenant to you. Mm. So the nation sees this is God's special people, but they're no longer attached to this very promise of land. Mm-hmm. So it makes God out to be either unfaithful to his word, this unilateral covenant that he made, or that his love is a fair weather love. It's not a committed eternal love. And we see in the Torah that God says, I have an everlasting love for you. Or that he's just too weak. He can't protect his people, and the nations come and cast them, out of their own land. So it says in Ezekiel 36 that God says, I had concern for my holy name's sake that you have profaned. I will bring you back to your own land. He actually uses that phrase, your own land, as if I promised you this land for you and you alone. And then it says, when you get to the land, then I will sprinkle clean water on you and you will be clean. I will take out your heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and you will follow my decrees and my laws. I'm going to motivate you to do that. What comes first? It's the return of the Jewish people by God's mercy and his concern for his own name, not because Israel is any holier than any other nation, not because they're any better than any other nation, but because God made a covenant, he must keep that covenant. So he brings them back. Then he causes them to have a spiritual renewal, a rebirth. And it's first the return, an act of grace and mercy, and then it's them responding to follow him. And the very next chapter confirms it. The next chapter is Ezekiel 37, the vision of the dry bones. These bones are scattered in a great valley. They're brittle, they're dry, no hope of them ever being reincorporated again. Suddenly, in the vision, Ezekiel sees these bones come together. There's a clashing sound when the bones come together. And then ligaments and flesh and skin comes upon these bones, and they are reincorporated as a nation again. However, there's something missing. There's no breath in this body. There's no spiritual life. Again, it's the physical restoration, reincorporation as a nation, then the spiritual. So first to the land and then to the Lord.
So if I'm to summarize what you're saying, then you're saying that it's the pattern of God from the Old Testament to bring the Jewish people back to this land that he had promised them, and that the covenant remains solid even to them today, and that subsequent to that would be the outpouring of the Spirit to a spiritual rebirth, which of course we would consider rooted in Christ and the coming of the Spirit and the birth of the church.
Yeah. And let me mention Jeremiah 31, the new covenant. Okay. It says in that passage, I'm going to make a new covenant with you, but I'm giving you a fresh slate. Okay, I'm going to forgive the fact that you were adulterous in your worshiping other gods, being unfaithful to me as your husband, but I'm going to bring you back. Hosea, almost the whole book of Hosea is wooing this wife who's gone off and been with other lovers, and then God woos her back to himself in the valley of Achor. And in a time of trouble, she comes back to her husband, who is God. the God of Israel. So that's the pattern. And let's put it this way. You and I are saved not because we're better than anybody else, but God, by his sovereign choice, elects us. And he, Ephesians chapter 2 says, it is by grace you are saved through faith. This is not something of yourselves. You didn't earn it. It's a gift that God has given you. And so we shouldn't say, well, God only treats Israel that way. No, he treats everybody that way. If it weren't for his initiative to draw us to himself, we would not be drawn. And sometimes we put an onus on Israel to be this holy people, then they deserve the land, then they deserve to be blessed. Well, it's not true for any of us. We're only chosen and blessed because God decided to do that by his own sovereign
that's
choice.
good. That's good, Wayne. So one of the questions in that as well, land, Gaza. But I'm sure you've had a lot of questions, and
Sure.
millennials have a lot of questions about that word genocide,
Sure.
of what's happening in Gaza, and is it right?
Right.
What's going on right now?
Okay.
Wayne.
So let me give you a little perspective. So October the 7th, there was a ceasefire until that day. A group called Hamas,
Yes.
which is an acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement, decides that they're going to invade Israel on one of the holiest days of the year. It's the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles. It's a Sabbath. Most of the soldiers are at home with their families enjoying that holiday. And Israel is caught off guard. It's an intelligence failure of huge magnitude. Everyone's shocked today because I think Israel's been known as having incredible intelligence.
Yes.
And that it didn't happen. So they broke a ceasefire. They came and massacred 1,200 Israelis. Interestingly enough, most of them peaceniks. The ones living around the border of Gaza in Israel proper were generally left-leaning, peace-loving, believing that Gazans, for the most part, are peace-loving people, and we'll figure this out one day. We'll find a way we'll sign a peace treaty. There'll be a two-state reason to fight them. I mean, they were peaceniks.
And they were at a electronic dance music festival.
Yeah, there was
right?
a music
just
festival.
having a good weekend.
Young people
Mhm.
just having a good time, and they just randomly shot and raped, by the way. Villages, we call them kibbutzim or moshavim, slaughtered as well. I've been there myself. I had a bulletproof vest on and a helmet, and went and I saw the devastation of what they caused. Now, that would be genocidal in terms of purpose. I mean, the only reason they didn't kill more people was that finally the soldiers rallied together and they were able to stop this thing. But it actually took a couple of days. So what does Israel do? I think the proper answer for a question like this, I would say to anybody from another nation that's looking from a distance, what would you do if that happened in Canada? If it happened at the U.S. border with BC and 1,200 people massacred for no reason? You wouldn't just sit there. I mean, you would respond. So Israel responds. And what Israel does, and I've heard this from many people, saying that it's the most moral army in the world. Now, Israel's killed a lot of people, but they have actually warned the people in Gaza, leave this particular area because we're coming into that area. They even created a corridor for people to move out of that area so that they could deal with what they needed to deal with, terrorists that were there. And over 500 kilometers of tunnels under mosques, hospitals, clinics, homes. what do you do? You know, apparently Hamas has been planning this attack for 10 years and built that tunnel system so that they can shoot rockets at Israel against innocent citizens. I've been in rocket attacks myself, even recently. They're not targeting an army base. They're not targeting a particular unit of soldiers. They're attacking randomly civilians. So what do you do? So these tunnels were built in such a way not only to escape in case Israel invaded, but what they do is they shoot a rocket and then they go back into the tunnel. So Israel can't even hit the launchers because it's all, and Israel's gone in. And by the way, a lot of the soldiers have cameras on their chest. They are logging everything that they are doing. And they're doing everything they can do not to violate international laws. They're doing their best. And they drop pamphlets from the sky saying, hey, we're going to attack, get out of here, and we're going to help you leave. And it has been proven now that when Israel has allowed an escape corridor, that Hamas itself has shot their own people because they realize that a Gazan citizen is actually a shield for them. They're using them as human shields. That's genocidal in some way. Israel's not perfect, so I'm not here to advocate everything Israel does. But I don't know of any other army in history that has done more to avoid causing war crimes. They're doing their best, but you're going to have civilians that die in the process. If you build a tunnel or you have a launcher inside a mosque or inside a hospital, you're going to have innocent people that die. The other thing people need to know is the majority of Gazans still support Hamas.
Right.
They celebrate the massacre and the rapes and the torture and the brutality of that day. That's a scary thing.
Because of their hatred against Israel, obviously.
Yeah. And also with their own theology, a belief that if you're killed in the cause of liquidating Israel and taking their land, that they're going to get a special heaven, a place in heaven. It's a martyrdom thing, and so they celebrate that. Even parents of their teenage son or daughter who end up killing themselves, maybe as suicide bombers or civilian terrorists, they mourn the loss of their child, but they also celebrate the fact they did this for a great cause, and they've got an eternal, reward in heaven for what they've done.
I want to, we don't have a lot of time left. I want to steer towards some solution.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually believe there is a solution. And I think you do too. Before we leave the land issue, if we could do a quick geography for dummies, there's a couple of questions that I have following up from Doug. One is the land that Israel has from Lebanon to Gaza, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, roughly the same land that was biblical? Is it bigger or smaller? So that's one.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want to ask where the West Bank and Gaza came from after Israel was brought into nationhood after World War II.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the overall present Israel proper as a state is the size of the state of New Jersey.
It's quite
very
small. Yeah.
The Arab nations roundabout have more than 500 times the geographical land. And you asked about what was the biblical geography, what was promised to Israel. It's greater than what Israel is today. So
It's greater because it's on the land given to Joshua, or the 12 tribes, was on the other side of the Jordan.
Well, you had 2.5 tribes that were on the east bank of the Jordan.
Right.
Which the west bank, of course, is this disputed territory.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the next question is, the Holocaust occurred after World War II. they wanted to give the Jews a land. Sort of like what you said about God bringing people back.
Mhm.
And so they were given this land, and I think it was like within a day, the Arab nations attacked,
Right.
and Israel fought back. And so it was in fighting back in some of these wars where the West Bank was taken and where Gaza was taken, and some of the territory was enlarged.
Mhm.
Correct?
Yeah, I think we need to go back slightly earlier, but uh, the Ottoman Empire dominated the entire Middle East region, including what we call Israel today. World War I, the Ottomans were defeated. The British and the French and other nations divided up portions of the Middle East into various pieces. They called that region Palestine, and the British then they had what's called the British Mandate. And the goal of the mandate already in those early days, it's called the Balfour Declaration, was to find a homeland for the Jewish people. And it was a large area, which includes much of Jordan today and what we now call Israel today, and the West Bank and Gaza. By the time the partition plan, which was in 1947, happened, Israel was offered a tiny little portion of what they were originally promised by the British Mandate and other nations, larger allied nations who bought into that same idea. So 1947, they have a partition plan. It's a two-state solution. Israel gets a piece, the Arabs get a piece. The Arabs decided this is not our land. We want more than that, and we don't believe Israel has a right to exist. But the United Nations votes,
Mm-hmm.
and in that vote, declare that Israel is a nation on that little small piece of real estate. When Israel declared officially, we are now the state of Israel, they named it Israel. They could have chosen other names, but they chose Israel. That was on May 14th, 1948. That night, the very night that they declared it, the surrounding nations,
Right.
most of them, attacked Israel,
Mm-hmm.
and it became the War of Independence. Israel survived, and I would say miraculously.
Right.
It was against all odds, and they maintained their nation. Later, they ended up having control over even more land because of the Six-Day War in 1967. I don't know if you want to go there, but that's how we talk about the West Bank and we talk about Gaza. It has a lot to do with what happened in 1967.
Right. And the Yom Kippur War in
Following
70,
that. But
73.
67 was a critical war.
So we now have a church in a growing church, and maybe you can give us the statistics of that. When you went there, followers of Jesus, very small, and it's still very small, but it's growing.
Yeah, when we went there were probably 500 Jewish followers of Jesus and maybe 2,000 Arab born-again evangelical believers in the land. Today, there would be probably 25,000 Jewish believers, maybe 4,000 Arab believers. This is in Israel proper, the state of Israel.
Right.
And yes, it's growing, but a very small portion still. Israel's almost 10 million people now. 21% of Israel's population, in other words, a little over 2 million in Israel proper, are Arabs.
Right.
They have full rights as citizens of Israel. We even have a Muslim Arab Supreme Court justice. We have Arab parties represented in our parliament, in the Knesset. And in fact, there was a Muslim party that was part of the coalition, the government coalition, a few years ago. They're no longer there, but they were there.
Mm-hmm.
So Israel is the only democratic nation in the entire Middle East, and they treat Arabs well. I can tell you this is interesting. I did some research recently that 46% of all new licenses for medical doctors are Arabs. And the majority now, I think it's 51%, of pharmacists are Arabs. When I go to the pharmacy, it's typically I'm seeing women in Arab garb, Muslim garb, and you're not seeing them on the streets protesting. They're not in Tel Aviv and they're not in Jerusalem. They're not anywhere saying, down with Israel, and, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Arabs in Israel are not saying that.
Right.
They're quite happy being in the state of Israel, with all of the rights and the benefits that come
and the
with
security
it. And the economy. I mean,
the economy. Yeah. There are different types of people that the nation would be made up of religiously. So, beside Christians or Messianic Jews, tell me about the other groups that are there that the church is trying to love.
Well, within
reach.
the Jewish community, you have the main and the largest group would be Orthodox, whereas in North America, the largest would be Reformed, which is very, shall we say, liberal, and some don't even believe God exists. But it's a Jewish community, and the synagogue is a community center. It's not really a religious type place. But in Israel, the vast majority are Orthodox, so they believe in the Torah, take it literally. They keep the Sabbath very literally. That's one group, and then you have very small Reforms, very small conservative Orthodox Jews. Now, within Orthodoxy, there's some interesting differences. So you might see pictures of Jews wearing black suits, black hat, side curls. We would call them Haredim, or in English, we'd just say ultra-Orthodox.
Right.
And they tend to be very much separate from the rest of society. They live in their own ghettos that they created. They're not forced into a ghetto, but they want to be together, and they would see the rest of the Jews as fully legitimate, because they would understand Jewishness is more than just your DNA. It's also
Your practice.
your practice,
yeah.
etc. And then you have another group of Orthodox that we call them knitted kippah. So, a kippah or a yarmulke, they're typically knitted. They don't wear unusual clothing. They look like everybody else, but they'll wear a kippah. And they keep the Torah like everyone else, but they live as part of the rest of society. They might even send their kids to a secular school. But at home and at synagogue, they would invest in the spirituality of their children. But they don't want to be separate from the rest of society. There's an interesting group within the ultra-Orthodox that actually don't believe the state of Israel is legitimate. They believe that only the Messiah, when he comes, will there be a legitimate theocracy under the leadership of the Messiah. So that's an interesting.
And what percentage would be secular, and what percentage would be religious?
Yeah, when we got there, I think most people would say 15% of the population would be Orthodox among the Jews. Okay, We're not talking about the Arabs now. Today, my guess would be it'd be closer to 30%. And in the city of Jerusalem, where we live and have lived there the entire time, it's gone from probably 20% to maybe 50% of the Jewish population. Very religious. And you would think you're in another country. You go to Tel Aviv, it's more the economic capital. You've got hundreds of skyscrapers. It looks like downtown Vancouver.
It's on the ocean. It's beautiful.
It's beautiful. But almost all secular.
Yeah. Tell us, Doug, both of us have talked about the challenges that Israel faces, but there's hope for the nation of Israel, and Firm, in many ways, embraces that because of the 70 partners in bringing Jew and Gentile, Jew and Arab together. And tell us what you believe is the hope and the future of Israel and why you've given your life to it.
Yeah, well, I believe the only hope is the Prince of Peace, the Messiah, Jesus, the Jew. But, he came not just to his own, but he came to the whole world. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. So that is the hope. And it takes a change of the heart, okay? It's not just a change that comes through signing a peace treaty or putting up walls to protect yourself and have borders and so on. It's a change of heart. And as I said earlier in Ezekiel 36, I will take out your heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. I'm going to soften your heart, and you're going to love people that don't look like you, don't act like you, and you'll leave. And Jesus said, you need to love your enemies, and that's the key. And that only happens with a radical transformation that happens through the new birth, where God's presence comes in the person of his Holy Spirit into your heart, and you look at the world differently, you look at each other differently, and you seek peace. You want to be reconciled. You want to make sure that that hatred doesn't belong, jealousy doesn't belong. And they will know that we are his disciples if we love one another.
Yeah.
That's the key.
And you told a story about someone that came to the church and was antagonistic towards the gospel.
Yeah, this was a number of years ago. He came because of a girlfriend who brought him along, Arab from the old city of Jerusalem. And he was so upset with who we are because we tend to celebrate our Jewish roots, and we're in Israel. And so we sang a lot of our songs in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
We read from the Torah portion every week. We have, a Jewish culture in how we worship, and it just drove him crazy. And he said to me, "I wanted to burn you guys to the ground." He had that much hatred. But then he had a revelation in his own bedroom several nights, getting a vision of Jesus. And he eventually just bowed his knee, and he came to me and said, "Hey, I'm with you." And I baptized him, and I was one of his early mentors. And today he's one of the greatest evangelists among Arab-speaking peoples around the world.
And so needless to say, in his life, he now considers Jewish believers brothers and sisters.
Absolutely.
And has a love, a forgiveness, and a relationship.
He does. And he's actually got a vision to plant a church that is for Jewish believers and Arab believers together.
Yeah. And I think that's the hope for Israel. When I see the news and what's happening, the hatred, the anger, I think, only Jesus can bring forgiveness and healing and hope and reconcile relationships. And so that's why I'm so grateful that you're there, both as King of Kings and as Firm. So thank you for fanning into flame hope and a future for Israel. I think you've got the key.
Wayne, it's really great having you on the Orange Pew. But I think as we are wrapping up, what would you say to our millions of subscribers just to plead with us? How do we respond? How do we pray for you, for Israel, for what's happening in Gaza?
Yeah. Well, Paul in Romans 9-11, he focuses in on what is Israel, what does God want to do with his people Israel? And Paul, a Pharisee, a Jew himself, a Benjaminite, he calls himself in Romans 11. He has a passion for the salvation of his own countrymen. He said, if it were possible for me to be cut off and accursed for the sake of the salvation of my countrymen, I would do it. Obviously impossible. But he just believed that it takes prayer. And he said, my prayer for my people is this. And he also says in Romans chapter 11 that we are one body. The Jews, yes, God has called them in a special way, but non-Jews, he calls them wild olive branches, get engrafted into the same tree of Israel and the same faith with Abraham at the root of that, the faith of Abraham. Galatians talks a lot about that. And it's through Jesus. That we ought to start seeing, I think, Jewish people as our future brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
And by faith believe they will come into their own olive tree.
Yes.
If God could do the miraculous to bring a wild olive branch into a natural tree, how much more readily can the natural branches be regrafted into their own tree. He says that clearly. And he also said, don't become proud and arrogant toward those branches, some of which are cut off now because of lack of faith. Be humble. Sadly, anti-Semitism is growing, and we don't have time to go into it, but even within the church, historically, anti-Semitism has creeped in, calling Israel rejected by God, therefore we should reject them.
Replacement theory,
Replacement theology, exactly. So what should we do? We should pray for the salvation of Israel. We should love God's chosen people. He has not rejected them once and for all, but will regraft them back into their own tree. We should fight against anti-Semitism. I believe we need to speak up as a church and say, if God loves the Jewish people with an everlasting love, then we ought to love them as well. And you know, it's really interesting. Jesus said to the Samaritan woman at the well, he said that salvation is from the Jews. And of course, I already talked about, you know, God's promise to Abraham that you'll be a blessing to all the families of the earth. Well, if in fact the Jews are strategically placed by God to bring the revelation of the one true God to the world, and if their call still remains, and he says in Romans 11, he says, the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. And he's saying that about the Jews. Then we ought to pray for their salvation so that the world will be saved. Because they are called to be, as I said earlier, a royal priesthood, mediators, as it were, to bring the truth to the world. And he said in Isaiah chapter 42 and 49 that they are called to be a servant who are a light to the nations. And I believe that Israel will resume their role as a light to the nations. Zechariah chapter 8, verse 22 and 23. There's coming a day when 10 men from every nation are going to take a hold of the hem, the garment, or the prayer shawl of a Jew and say that we hear that God is with you. That's a future promise that has not yet been fulfilled. Jerusalem will once again be a place of revelation to the world, and Jewish people are going to play a significant role in that day.
Thank you for coming to the Orange Pew and sharing this hour with us. The opportunity to hear from an elder and an ambassador in that land is truly rich. We take what you've shared with us to heart. We will pray. We will support. We will stand up when called upon against anti-Semitism, and we continue to cheer you on and Firm and all of those related ministries. Keep representing Jesus, and he is the hope of the nation, both Jew and Arab. And we're just so delighted that you were with us. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. What a privilege to be here, and thank you for the amazing support and what you're doing to help us take the next step into the future.
God bless you. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time from the Orange Pew. We're grateful that you joined us this week, and we're looking forward to our next podcast. Thanks for listening to the Orange Pew. To stay up to date, please subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or YouTube Podcasts. We'll see you next time.